Right now, the festive season is approaching and many people will be traveling across the country using different transport methods. For those looking to fly, there's some bad news. The country's overall flight capacity has nearly halved since Comair's liquidation. Only 4 domestic airlines remain and there are fears of a shortage of seats during the festive season. Well, to give us more details, I'm joined now by FlySafair's Chief Marketing Officer, Kirby Gordon. Mr. Gordon, thank you very much for your time here on eNCA. Just firstly, tell me how this is going to affect you. I mean, we're out of the COVID-19 woods, so we expect that there'll be a swell-up of people traveling, even locally. So how is this going to affect the airline business?
Absolutely. Look, I think that's very much the dynamic that's at play. It's wonderful to see that the consumer demand for air travel has increased quite as healthily as it has, which I think is wonderful news. It speaks very well to what the bigger kind of tourism infrastructure should be able to expect come this holiday season, when we know a lot of South Africans particularly tend to visit, our coastal regions and other parts of the country. But the issue that we're facing as an industry at this point is something of a capacity constraint. The good news is that, if I can put it into numbers, South Africans pre-COVID were used to having a selection of about 1.6 million seats available to them on domestic flights or on domestic routes per month. And that number had sort of started to recover just pre-Comair's departure to about 1.2. So we were about 3/4 of the way back to what we'd known before COVID. Unfortunately, with the departure of Comair from the market, we saw that go down to about 900,000, which was obviously quite a blow. The good news is that we're up to 1.2 again. As of October, as of this month, in terms of what's published across all airlines, we've effectively plugged that gap. And the view would be that obviously moving toward December, we'll certainly be adding as many aircraft as we can and hiring as fast as we can in order to try and actually meet those capacity constraints. So at FlySafair, we have another aircraft that we'll be adding midway through this month, and with a little luck, hopefully another even before the end of the year as well, and then certainly many more in the beginning of next year to try and just increase this capacity requirement that we need.
Now tell me, in terms of all these airlines that have been liquidated in South Africa, quite embarrassing, when you see everything that's been happening in our aviation industry. The international airlines are doing much better than us. So how is this going to affect, for instance, your local trips?
I think, that is the reality. We've always had quite an interesting airline dynamic in South Africa. If one compares the number of players that we've had in the market contending just for what is actually in international standards a relatively small domestic market compared to big international markets, it's always been quite interesting and quite hotly contended. And, a key element to a proper aviation concern is actually having, enough sort of economies of scale to take advantage of. So, to put that in perspective, we've got a fleet of about 25 Boeing 737 aircraft. If you look at the likes of Ryanair or Vueling or some of the big European carriers or the Americans, with Southwest Airlines, they've got hundreds of aircraft in their fleet. So it sort of makes sense that at some point there needed to be a rationalization of some means in that capacity. And I think that the incumbent players are doing very well and scaling very quickly in a fairly challenging environment to ensure that we can be there to meet the demands of our consumers and to aid our economy in this recovery.
And Kirby, will this dynamic also affect pricing, for instance, in terms of getting tickets, flying tickets? Will it affect it in any bad way?
Actually, it should be the opposite, to be honest.
Okay.
I mean, the reality is when a capacity constraint is in play at any given point, you do see the increase in the costs of the tickets because those last few seats that sell are, of course, always the most expensive ones to go. I mean, that's a key element to making our business work in the long run, is to do that. But the reality is there's a lot less value for us as an airline to have fewer seats that we're selling at higher prices than there is in terms of having more seats that you could sell at a good price, rather than a very high price. So that's certainly the goal, is to make sure that we can increase that supply as much as possible. And that will in turn then actually serve to drive down those prices across the board.
And just lastly, Kirby, in terms of the jet fuel issue, it looks like you have so many issues just facing the aviation industry. If it's not airlines that are unable to function and are being liquidated, it's COVID-19. When that goes, it's suddenly the fact that you have, less options for your customers now in the aviation industry. And now there's this shortage of jet fuel. So how is this going to, hopefully, of course, by December, when people start traveling, it will be sorted? Is that the, is that the assurance you're getting, at least from Airports Company South Africa?
You're absolutely right. There's never a dull day in aviation. It's certainly a very interesting industry to be involved in. The fuel shortage in Cape Town particularly is something of concern to us. I'm sure you'd be familiar with the dynamics that post-COVID, we obviously had a number of refineries that were local in South Africa that had closed down. So it's sort of shifted our reliance to a lot of fuels, to importing a lot more fuel, which of course we saw on the front of diesel. There was a ship that was obviously stranded or unable to dock in Mossel Bay in time, and then of course we've had the same now with the supply of Jet A1 from a separate vessel. So the reality is that obviously I think there've been a few school fees paid along the way now in terms of what needs to happen to ensure that we're stockpiling enough fuel as a country to ensure that if these sorts of disruptions happen along the way, as is potentially the case when one is importing and so reliant upon import, that we can actually have enough safeguard to make sure that we get our way through. So hopefully those lessons have been learned. It's certainly been an incredibly busy weekend for us. We've managed to salvage our entire schedule. We haven't had to cancel any flights, and we've not had to limit the number of people on any flights. We've managed to actually complete the schedule. It's been a lot of work to make sure that we get the fuel and all of the plans in place to ensure that we can do that. And hopefully that we'll have this ship arriving this week, and that should then ameliorate that problem. And that there should be sufficient ordering and planning going forward to both accommodate the increase in the amount of flying that we're expecting to do. And obviously have sufficient buffer should this happen again.
Well, all the best. Thank you very much for speaking to us here on eNCA. Kirby Gordon, he's the marketing officer at FlySafair.